In 1866, the United States Department of Agriculture released a report on urban food supply in 31 American cities. The investigators expected disorder. What they found instead was something they struggled to name: neighborhood provisioning networks so precisely coordinated that the report's lead surveyor used the word interlocking 3 times in a single paragraph. Price agreements between farmers and local vendors that had held without legal enforcement for 40 years. Credit extended between families and sellers across seasons, sometimes across years, with no bank involved at any stage. I spent months trying to understand why that report is not in a single American history textbook. What I found wasn't about food. It was about what had to be made invisible before something else could be sold to us as necessary. I came to this through a mason jar. My great-aunt left me a wooden crate when she died, filled with 63 mason jars, each one labeled in her handwriting. Not just the contents, but the source. Brandywine tomatoes, Heller Farm, 1962. Corn relish, traded for 2 days' help with the Kowalski harvest. Apple butter, from the shared press on Mill Road, September. I started trying to understand what that crate represented. Not sentimentality, not rural nostalgia, but a system. The labels weren't personal decoration, they were records. And once I understood what kind of records they were, I understood why the system that produced them had to be replaced. Before supermarkets, before refrigerated rail cars, before any national grocery chain existed, American communities fed themselves through what historians of agricultural economics now call the local provisioning system. The term is bland, the reality was not. In most American towns before 1870, food moved through a layered network of mutual obligations, price agreements, and extended credit that functioned with a precision the official histories have never adequately described. Farmers brought surplus to local provision stores, not on consignment, but understanding agreements that guaranteed them a baseline price, regardless of seasonal fluctuation. Those prices were not set by negotiation between individual buyers and sellers. They were set collectively by elected community members called assessors or measurers, depending on the region, who examined quality, calculated fair return, and published their figures publicly so that no single vendor could undercut or inflate without the entire network knowing. The Bureau of Agricultural Economics, in a 1924 internal report on the history of American food distribution, described the system this way. In the pre-railroad era, local food economies displayed a remarkable degree of self-regulation, with price-setting mechanisms that functioned independently of both state authority and market speculation. The report noted that this self-regulation was not accidental. It was structural, built into the provisioning agreements themselves, which typically required any participating vendor to submit to community price review as a condition of access to the network. Exit the network, and you lost access to the surplus pool. Stay in it, and you accepted the constraints the community imposed. Credit inside these networks operated on logic that no modern bank would recognize. A family that suffered a bad harvest did not approach a lender. They approached the network. Their debt was recorded in the provision store's ledger, held open without interest for as long as the assessors judged reasonable, and repaid in labor, in future surplus, or in kind. The 1924 Bureau report cited ledger records from a provisioning cooperative in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, showing credit lines held open for periods ranging from 8 months to 4 years, with repayment accepted in 17 different non-currency forms, including seed stock, fence repair, and midwifery services. These were not informal arrangements. They were recorded, witnessed, and enforceable within the network's own governance structure. What the mason jar labels in my great-aunt's crate recorded was the edge of this system, still functioning in diminished form in the 1960s, decades after the national grocery infrastructure had been built around and over it. Heller Farm was not a supplier in the modern sense. It was a neighbor inside a network. 2 days' help with the Kowalski harvest was not barter in the primitive sense the economics textbooks describe. It was a transaction inside a system that had been tracking obligations and balancing them across an entire community for generations. The shared press on Mill Road was not a quaint rural tradition. It was infrastructure, collectively owned, collectively maintained, its output distributed according to contribution rather than purchasing power. The system was not perfect. The 1924 Bureau report acknowledged that assessor corruption occurred. that some networks excluded newcomers, that price agreements occasionally calcified into arrangements that protected established vendors against legitimate competition. But the report also noted something the official history does not emphasize. In the communities where the provisioning system remained intact through the 1880s, food insecurity during the economic panics of 1873 and 1893 was measurably lower than in communities that had already transitioned to cash and credit purchasing from centralized suppliers. The networks absorbed shocks that the market system transmitted directly to the families least able to bear them. I kept returning to those jar labels, traded for 2 days' help, from the shared press. The language was so matter-of-fact, so stripped of any sense that this was unusual or remarkable. For my great-aunt, it wasn't. It was simply how food moved. The system it described was already old when she was born, already centuries deep in the communities that maintained it. And then, in the space of 1 decade, the conditions that made it possible were methodically removed. Not by accident, not by the natural progress of a modernizing economy, by specific decisions made by specific people, for reasons the legislation stated plainly if you read it carefully enough. February 26, 1867, Congress passes the Warehouse Act, establishing federal licensing requirements for any facility storing grain or produce intended for interstate commerce. The stated purpose was consumer protection, standardization, the elimination of fraud in storage weights and measures. The actual effect, documented in a dissenting report filed by 7 House members and preserved in the Library of Congress, was the systematic exclusion of small community provisioning stores from the interstate food network. To receive a federal license, a storage facility had to meet capital requirements that the dissenting report estimated at between $800 and $1,200, approximately 3 to 4 years of income for a farming family in 1867. Community provision stores, which had operated on collective contribution rather than individual capital, could not meet the threshold. They were not banned. They were simply made structurally impossible to sustain at the scale the new food economy required. 9 months earlier, in May 1866, Congress had passed the Internal Revenue Act's expansion, which for the first time applied federal taxation to goods exchanged through non-currency transactions above a minimum threshold. Barter at the community level was not criminalized, it was taxed, which meant it had to be documented, which meant it required the kind of record-keeping infrastructure that small provisioning networks did not possess and could not afford to build. The 1924 Bureau of Agricultural Economics report noted the consequence directly. Following the 1866 revenue expansion, participation in documented exchange networks outside the currency economy declined by an estimated 60% in 19 northeastern states within 5 years. Not because the communities chose to stop, because the administrative burden of compliance made continuation economically irrational. 2 pieces of legislation, 9 months apart. One made community food storage unviable. One made community exchange prohibitively complex. Historians who have examined this period separately treat each law as a response to legitimate regulatory needs. And they are not wrong about the stated purposes. But here is what I keep returning to. The Warehouse Act and the revenue expansion arrived in the same legislative session as the first major federal land grants to railroad companies for the construction of refrigerated freight lines. The Pacific Railroad Acts of 1862 and 1864 had already transferred approximately 170 million acres of public land to railroad corporations. By 1867, those corporations were lobbying actively for a national food distribution network that would route all significant produce through their lines. A network that required centralized storage facilities, federally licensed ones, with capital requirements that excluded the old provisioning stores. Not coincidence, pattern. The pattern extended backward as well as forward. The National Banking Act of 1863, which this research kept returning to from a different direction, had already restructured the credit system in ways that made the provisioning network's internal credit logic increasingly marginal. When a family's debt could be held in a community ledger for 4 years and repaid in fence repair, they had no need of a bank. When that same debt had to be settled in currency, in a system where currency was controlled by federally chartered institutions that charged interest, the community ledger became a record of liability rather than a record of mutual obligation. The Lancaster County Cooperative, whose records the Bureau had cited, showed a sharp decline in non-currency repayment after 1865, not because the community stopped valuing those arrangements, but because the families carrying ledger debt increasingly needed currency to meet obligations the new system required of them. The food system and the banking system were not separate. They were one system, and they were being replaced by one system, and the replacement was happening faster than any single community could track or resist. I started pulling on a specific thread at this point in the research, one I almost dismissed as a coincidence of its own. The years between 1865 and 1875 saw the founding of the first American chain grocery operations. The Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, known later as A&P, had been founded in 1859, but expanded from 11 stores to 31 between 1865 and 1869 alone. By 1880, it operated 95 stores across the northeastern United States. Historians of retail typically describe this expansion as a response to consumer demand, to urbanization, to the efficiency advantages of centralized purchasing. Those factors were real, but the Bureau's 1924 report contained a detail I had not seen cited anywhere else. In 4 of the 7 northeastern cities it examined in depth, A&P's earliest store locations were within 2 blocks of former community provision stores that had closed between 1866 and 1872. The timing was not proof, but it was a fact that fit the pattern without requiring any adjustment. The communities that survived this transition with their provisioning logic most intact were the ones with the strongest internal governance structures. The Mormons in Utah had built a cooperative economic system, the United Order, that maintained community food storage, collective pricing, and mutual credit into the 1880s. The system was not identical to the Eastern provisioning networks, but its structure followed the same logic. Brigham Young described it in an 1874 address, preserved in the Latter-day Saint Church archives, as a system designed to make the saints independent of every other source. By 1882, federal legislation targeting Mormon economic practices had effectively dismantled the United Order's communal property arrangements. The Edmunds Act of 1882 is remembered primarily for its provisions against polygamy. Its economic provisions, which restricted cooperative property holding among Utah's Mormon communities, receive almost no attention in the standard histories. The legislation did not say it was dismantling a food system. It did not need to. The effect was the same. I thought about the mason jar labeled corn relish, traded for 2 days' help with the Kowalski harvest. That transaction had a name in the old system. It had a record, a witness, a place in a ledger that tracked what the community owed each family and what each family owed the community. By the time my great-aunt made that jar, in 1962, the ledger was gone. The transaction survived only as a label, a private memory of a logic that had once been public infrastructure. The warehouse that might have stored that corn, under a collective pricing agreement, had been replaced by a grocery chain. The credit that might have carried the Kowalski family through a bad harvest had been replaced by a loan with an interest rate the old usury laws would not have permitted. The assessor who might have published a fair price for that corn so the entire network could see it had been replaced by a commodity market in Chicago, where the price was set by people who had never seen the field. There is a town in northeastern Ohio called Oberlin that most Americans know only as the home of a college. What the standard histories do not emphasize is that Oberlin spent most of the 19th century operating one of the most sophisticated community provisioning systems in the American Midwest. The Oberlin Community Cooperative, founded in 1847, maintained collective food storage, a community pricing board, and a mutual credit system that the college's own records describe as serving approximately 60% of the town's resident families at its peak in the 1870s. Farmers within a 12-mile radius participated under standing agreements that guaranteed baseline prices and access to the cooperative storage facilities. Families in town contributed labor, skills, or surplus goods and received provisioning credit in return. The system had operated without significant interruption for 30 years when the Federal Warehouse Act's licensing requirements reached Ohio's county enforcement offices in 1871. The cooperative applied for a federal storage license. It was denied. The capital requirement could not be met through collective contribution under the licensing rules as written, which required the capital to be held by a single named legal entity rather than distributed across a membership. The cooperative reorganized twice, attempting to meet the requirement. It was denied twice more. By 1879, the Oberlin Community Cooperative had ceased food storage operations. The college's archives contain the final meeting minutes, a single paragraph noting that the membership had voted to dissolve the provisioning function and transfer the storage building to private ownership. No elaboration, no protest recorded, just the quiet administrative language of an institution that had run out of legal room to exist. They did not choose to stop. They were structured out of existence. I keep thinking about that distinction. The provisioning networks that fed American communities for 2 centuries were not defeated by consumer preference. They were not outcompeted in a fair market. They were made structurally impossible by a sequence of legislative decisions that arrived too quickly and from too many directions for any single community to mount an effective response. The Warehouse Act removed their storage infrastructure. The revenue expansion made their exchange logic administratively untenable. The banking system removed their internal credit arrangements. Railroad land grants built the physical infrastructure of the replacement system before the old one had fully collapsed. Each piece arrived in sequence. Each piece was necessary for the next piece to function. Some communities held on longer than others. The mutual aid societies that served immigrant communities in northeastern cities maintained provisioning logic into the early 20th century, operating food cooperatives, collective purchasing arrangements, and community credit funds that the settlement house records of the 1890s describe in detail. The National Consumers League, founded in 1899, documented dozens of these arrangements in its early reports, noting that they consistently produced lower food costs and greater price stability for participating families than the chain grocery alternatives available in the same neighborhoods. By 1920, most had been absorbed, dissolved, or simply starved of the membership density they needed to function as the surrounding economy made. Participation in the cash and credit system increasingly unavoidable. The ones that survived longest were the ones with the strongest reasons outside economics to maintain their internal systems. The Amish, whose provisioning logic was embedded in religious practice rather than purely economic preference, maintained community food storage and mutual credit arrangements that the surrounding economy could not easily reach. But even they required legal protection to do it. The Amish fought a prolonged series of conflicts with state and federal authorities over their refusal to participate in Social Security, which they understood not as a tax, but as a competing insurance system, one operated by an external institution rather than the community itself. Congress granted them a formal exemption in 1965 to maintain a food and mutual aid system that had functioned without legal challenge for over a century. They had to petition the federal government for permission to continue. The fact that they had to ask proves the old system had been made illegal by default. The fact that they were still running it proves it still worked. Sometimes I stop and ask myself whether I am drawing lines between things that were simply happening simultaneously. Legislation has unintended consequences. Markets create pressures that no single actor designed. The railroad companies wanted customers, not the destruction of provisioning networks specifically. The federal licensing requirements were written by people who may genuinely have believed they were standardizing a chaotic system, rather than dismantling a functional one. Maybe the pattern I keep seeing is a pattern I am bringing to the evidence rather than finding in it. And then I look at the Oberlin Cooperative's final meeting minutes. I look at the dissenting report from the 7 House members who calculated exactly who would be excluded by the Warehouse Act's capital requirements. I look at the Bureau of Agricultural Economics report that documented the 60% decline in non-currency exchange after 1866 and then was never cited again in any subsequent federal publication I have been able to locate. And the doubt recedes, not because the evidence proves conspiracy, but because it proves consequence. Deliberate, measurable, and compounding. I still have the mason jar crate. It sits on a shelf in my kitchen. The jar is empty now, the labels still legible in my great-aunt's careful handwriting. Brandywine tomatoes, Heller Farm, traded for 2 days' help, from the shared press on Mill Road. I look at those labels, and I think about what they encoded, the network behind each one, the assessors and the ledgers, and the standing agreements, and the collective storage, and the credit held open across seasons without interest. I think about the grocery store 3 blocks from my house. Its shelves stocked by a supply chain that touches 40 states and 3 countries. Its prices set by commodity markets my great-aunt never heard of. Its credit extended through a card that charges interest rates the usury laws of 1850 would have made criminal. Progress, the official story calls it. Efficiency, the natural evolution of a modernizing economy. But the Heller farm fed its neighbors for generations under an arrangement no bank administered. The shared press on Mill Road produced food for everyone who helped maintain it. The Kowalski harvest got done because the community kept a ledger that remembered what it was owed and what it owed in return. And then the ledger was replaced, and the press was sold, and the farm was absorbed into a supply chain, and we were told this was inevitable, the only possible outcome of a chaotic and primitive system finally brought into order. Why did the Warehouse Act's capital requirements apply to collective ownership structures, but not to individually held facilities of identical size? Why did the 1924 Bureau of Agricultural Economics report document a 60% decline in non-currency exchange and then disappear from every subsequent federal citation? Why did the Oberlin Cooperative's 3 license applications fail on the same capital structure grounds each time, when the requirement itself had been written after the cooperative already existed? Why do the first A and P locations in 4 northeastern cities sit within 2 blocks of provision stores that closed in the same legislative window? Why did the communities that maintained provisioning logic longest all require legal exemptions, court battles, or congressional petitions to keep doing what their grandparents had done without asking anyone's permission? The mason jar labels are still there. The handwriting is still clear. The system they recorded is almost entirely gone. And the questions that remain are not about food. They are about what we were told we needed, and who decided we needed it, and what was quietly removed before we thought to ask whether we had ever needed it at all.